For over 300 years, millions of African men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands, shackled, and forced onto ships bound for the Americas. This was the transatlantic slave trade, one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. But this story is not just about suffering. It is about resilience, defiance, and the indomitable human spirit. It is about those who fought back, on ships, on plantations, in courts, and in the hearts of those who sought justice. It began in the 1500s when European powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Dutch, established trade routes along the West African coast. Africans were captured in brutal raids or sold through complex trade networks. Families were ripped apart, futures stolen. Ivory, gold, and other trade resources attracted Europeans to West Africa. As demand for cheap labor to work on plantations in the Americas grew, people enslaved in West Africa became the most valuable commodity for European traders. Slavery existed in Africa before Europeans arrived. However, their demand for slave labor was so great that traders and their agents searched far inland, devastating the region. Powerful African leaders fueled the practice by exchanging enslaved people for goods such as alcohol, beads, and cloth. Among those taken were not just common villagers, but African nobility, royalty whose status and power meant nothing to the traders. Kings, queens, and princes were captured, their crowns cast aside as they were forced into chains. Figures like Prince Abdulrahman Ibrahima Sori of West Africa, once a noble leader, found himself enslaved in the American South, stripped of his title but never his dignity. Britain became the world's leading slave trading country. Transatlantic slavery was especially lucrative because ships could sail with full holds on every stage of their voyage, making large profits for merchants in London, Bristol, and Liverpool. Around 12 million Africans were enslaved in the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported about 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, the treacherous voyage across the Atlantic, was a floating hell. Overcrowding, poor diet, dehydration, and disease led to high death rates. 450,000 of the 3.4 million Africans transported in British ships died on the Atlantic crossing. Those who resisted by refusing food and water were beaten and force-fed. Attempts at more violent, organized rebellion were even more savagely punished. Some people preferred death to slavery and committed suicide during the voyage or later. Some revolted on board, fighting their captors with whatever weapons they could find. By the 16th century, Europeans had started to develop and cultivate regions in the Caribbean, North and South America. As demand for labor grew, Europeans turned to West Africa to supply an enslaved workforce. But they did not submit easily. These people were defined in law as chattels, the personal property of their owners, and were denied the right to live and move as they chose. Their forced labor produced commodities like tobacco, cotton, and sugar, for which there was a huge European demand. Nearly 2/3 of all enslaved people cut cane on sugar plantations. These were places of hard labor and cruel treatment with very high mortality rates. Despite this, African music, dance, and religious ceremonies flourished, evolving into new hybrid cultures and traditions. One of the first major revolts was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, where enslaved Africans armed themselves and fought for freedom. Though it was suppressed, it sent shockwaves through the system. Enslaved people fought to retain their families, cultures, customs, and dignity. Resistance took many forms, from keeping aspects of their identity and traditions alive to escaping and plotting uprisings. On the plantations, they broke tools, damaged crops, and feigned injury or illness in order to frustrate plantation owners and their ambitions for greater profits. At other times, they made bids for freedom by escaping. Sometimes these runaways grouped together and built their own independent, self-sufficient communities of resistance, often known as Maroons. Large-scale organized uprisings were a common reaction to the cruelties of the slave system. Potential and actual armed resistance also contributed to the ending of the slave trade and eventually slavery itself. Then there was Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant leader of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. Under his command, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose against their French oppressors, defeating one of the most powerful empires of the time. Their victory made Haiti the first free black republic. How did the slave trade develop in Britain? Elizabeth I believed that capturing Africans against their will would be detestable and call down the vengeance of heaven upon the undertakers. Yet after seeing the huge profits available, she lent royal ships to two slaving expeditions of John Hawkins, the first English trader of enslaved people from West Africa to the Americas. No English settlements were established in North America or in the West Indies during the reign of Elizabeth, but in the 17th century, the English began to acquire territory in the New World. The English colonies expanded rapidly, and the development of a plantation system and the growth of the Atlantic economy brought further demands for African labor. This increased the scale of the trade in enslaved people. In the first third of the 18th century, Britain's involvement in the slave trade grew enormously. In the 1710s and 1720s, nearly 200,000 enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in British ships. Everyday resistance and abolition. Not all resistance was armed. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, breaking tools, working slowly, preserving their languages and traditions, and passing secret messages through songs. Harriet Tubman, a fearless conductor of the Underground Railroad, led over 70 enslaved people to freedom, saying, "I never lost a passenger." Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man, used his voice and pen to expose the horrors of slavery, demanding its abolition. Abolitionism was one of Britain's first lobbying movements. The first meeting of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade took place in London in May 1787. African writers and activists, such as Olaudah Equiano, spoke out against the trade and its inhumane treatment of Africans. High-profile figures such as William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson also used their influence to effect its abolition. Abolitionists argued that in addition to stopping an immoral practice, ending the slave trade would save the lives of thousands of European sailors and open new markets for British goods. However, their pro-slavery opponents pointed out how important Caribbean plantations were to Britain's economy. The abolitionist movement gained momentum. Parliament finally passed an act to abolish the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in 1833. It stated that all slave trading by British subjects was utterly abolished, prohibited, and declared to be unlawful. The United States followed in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, but true freedom was, and still is, a fight that continues. Nearly 750,000 people remained enslaved in British colonies across the Caribbean. Abolitionists succeeded in mobilizing unprecedented public support. Through a campaign of information, they demonstrated what lay behind the sugar, tobacco, and coffee enjoyed by Britons. People signed petitions, attended lectures, and abstained from eating West Indian sugar. Many people who signed petitions could not vote, and this was their only means of expressing their opinion to Parliament. Over 100 petitions against the slave trade were submitted to Parliament in 1788, rising to 519 in 1792. For the first time in a public political campaign, women were extensively involved, adding their voices to the calls for abolition. Although the British Parliament outlawed slavery in 1807, a quarter of all Africans who were enslaved were transported across the Atlantic after this date. In British colonies, the institution of slavery carried on as before, until Parliament passed an Emancipation Act in 1833. This was achieved by a combination of active resistance in the Caribbean and campaigning in Britain. Even then, full emancipation was not realized until 1838, when a period of unpaid labor ended and 800,000 people were freed across the British Caribbean. But Parliament also voted to pay the plantation owners £20 million in compensation. No payment was made to the ex-slaves, the Royal Navy, and suppression of the slave trade. In 1808, the British West Africa Squadron was established to suppress illegal slave trading. Between 1820 and 1870, Royal Navy patrols seized over 1,500 ships and freed 150,000 Africans destined for slavery in the Americas. Many people believed that the only way to eradicate slavery was to promote legitimate trade and European forms of religion and government in Africa. This paved the way for colonial rule later in the 19th century. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just history, it is a lesson in strength. The enslaved fought for their humanity in ways big and small, their resistance shaping the world we live in today. We remember them, we honor them, and we carry their legacy forward. But what happened next? What were the lasting impacts of slavery, and how does its legacy shape our world today? Join us in part 3 as we dive deeper into the echoes of resistance and the fight for justice that continues to this day. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, subscribe at Smart Kydd Concepts, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss part 3. Let's keep learning and honoring this history together.